So, so Ryuichi was on the faculty for many years. He later in his career returned to Japan and to the University of Kyoto, where he was from. And after he passed away, the Travel Behavior and Values Committee decided to create this award in his honor. And the reason it focuses on a student authored paper in collaboration with the student's advisor is that Ryuichi was a beloved mentor to his students. He put so much into that relationship, working with students and helping them in their work and develop as researchers. So that's why this award is given this way. And one of my students won it one year, and it's like one of the things I'm most proud of. It's just, I think it's a very, very special award. So then as a part of the award, which comes with a little bit of money and you get a nice certificate, we invite the winner of the award to come to UC Davis to do a seminar for us. Unfortunately, Noah's not here in person. Noah, we wish you were here. It's a little cool here for us, but it's probably warmer than Minnesota. And we do have blue sky today, which is gorgeous. So, but we're glad you could make it online to do the seminar. So the winner of the Kitamura Award from last year is Noah Wexler and his advisor, Yingling Fan at the Humphrey Institute at the University of Minnesota. And so now I will turn it over to Noah to share his work with us. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you're up to now. That would be great. I'm looking at you here, but I should probably look here. Anyway, join me in congratulating and welcoming Noah.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Susan. Yeah, before I get started, I can briefly sort of talk about how this research started and what I'm up to now. So I'm in the public policy PhD program here at the Humphrey School, which is it's the policy school at the University of Minnesota, but it has an urban planning program, and the PhD program sort of is very interdisciplinary and bridges a lot of different fields. My main focus of research is actually in labor and urban economics, but for the first 3 years of the program here, I worked really closely with Yingling on a series of quantitative transportation projects. And this was the one that was initially funded. It came from a huge project at the University of Minnesota that brought together a bunch of departments. There were several engineering departments. There was the computer science department, the civil engineering department that were also involved in this. And the goal was to understand what a rollout of shared and connected automated vehicles would look like, using the Twin Cities region as sort of a case study and a grounds to examine how this would look in an urban area. And our specific group within this broader team was focused on looking at the social and the equity implications, seeing if there would actually be demand for such a system and what features could be implemented in such a system to ensure that people actually adopted it and it served policy goals that upheld equity considerations. So without further ado, I can go and get started and share my slides. Could someone allow me to screen share quickly? Thanks. Okay, should I just give a verbal indication to flip to the next slide?
Absolutely, just say next slide. That would work great.
All right, sounds like a plan. We can get started. This is the the title page. It's the name of the paper. And we can jump right into it so we can flip ahead. So yeah, the brief overview of what the presentation is going to look like. We're going to first go over the motivation of this research project and then the two specific research questions that the paper is going to answer. As I sort of talked about earlier, this paper was one of a number of different papers and reports that came out of a much broader research project. And even our team had a couple of other projects that we engaged in using a similar survey instrument but this is looking at our main survey to try to understand how people in the Twin Cities felt about shared automated vehicles. And so the specific research questions that we're going to talk about today are unique to the paper that was published in TRR and that we submitted a few years ago. And then we're going to walk through what the survey instrument actually looks like, and hopefully you'll get a good feel of what the participants who were taking the survey were seeing and interacting with when they were participants in the research. And then we'll talk about the data, a couple of findings, and a brief concluding slide. So we can go ahead. So the first research question is really trying to understand people's willingness to use shared automated vehicle technology. And we define shared automated vehicle technology as the maximum dollar value that someone would pay to take a trip between their home, which the survey gathers data on, and downtown Minneapolis. We're using specifically our metro to frame everything here. The maximum waiting time for that same trip, how much they'd have to wait before trying to hail the trip with one of these shared automated vehicles, and the vehicle actually arriving to take them to their destination. And then general comfort that's self-reported via a 5-point Likert scale. And the findings that we immediately bring forward from this question as a preview are that Black and Hispanic participants are willing to pay more than white participants for the ride, conditional on where they actually live. Willingness to pay is, unsurprisingly, positively correlated with income. People with automobile access are more willing to wait for a trip. And this is an interesting finding, and we'll discuss our read of this later on. People who are currently comfortable with sharing a vehicle during the COVID-19 pandemic, because as we'll talk about, an important aspect of this research is that this all happened after the beginning of the pandemic. So people's travel patterns were a little bit different than the pre-pandemic world. And they're also more willing to pay, wait, and are generally more comfortable with the SAV technology. And finally, people who experience more frequent transportation difficulties are more willing to pay and express more general comfort with riding in a shared automated vehicle with other passengers. We can go to the next slide. The next question is, what reveal design preferences for SAV technology, and how do they differ by demographics? And so what we're trying to dig into here is, what does this technology actually look like? What could it look like? What onboard features could exist on these vehicles? And do people reveal different preferences for different type of onboard features or vehicular features? And so we look at a number of different possible features or amenities for shared automated vehicles. And we start testing how people exhibit preferences for these different amenities by demographics, by income, et cetera. Some of the amenities we're looking at is, how does one actually book and pay for a trip on a shared automated vehicle? There's stuff like storage space that's relevant. Security measures are really important, and that's something that's commonly floated when people discuss automated vehicles. Is there ample sitting room? How is the seating arranged? Are there extra things like Wi-Fi or power outlets? All of these are possible features for a system of shared automated vehicles that not much research has been investigating so far. Really, what are the nitty-gritty details of the vehicles themselves when people are riding them? What is the user experience? And that's what we're trying to get into here. So we can flip to the next slide. There's really two motivating factors here. There is no currently running shared automated vehicle system, but a lot of urban areas are beginning to look into this as a possible mobility solution, especially when it comes to first and last mile problems. It's possible that an SAV system could improve transportation equity. It would be a fairly seamless, automated process by which people could get around. The question here is, it will only do so if it is adequately used by people of numerous demographics. And so we're trying to investigate what are impediments to use on the demand side of things. And if we can understand those impediments, then we can start to use SAV as a possibility to solve some transportation equity concerns and transportation accessibility issues. So those are the motivating and grounding factors that we're looking at throughout all this research. Next slide. So to start answering these questions, we needed to gather a lot of data from participants living in the Twin Cities. And to do that, we designed a pretty intricate survey instrument. The survey had 4 sections. The first is an introduction, which grounded what people were about to get into, included material on the IRB, etc. Most importantly, it included a video that showed some footage of automated vehicles, shared automated vehicles specifically, and explained at a very broad level what an SAV system would look like. Then the survey turned into opening questions about demographics and geography, and also these transportation questions that we talked about in the first research question. How comfortable do people feel with sharing a vehicle with others right now? How comfortable would they feel in an automated shared vehicle? The next part of the survey is about mapping. We wanted people to map their travel behavior so we could get a good understanding of the impediments they currently face to travel and how much travel they engage with on a weekly basis. And then finally, and I think most importantly for this paper, we have a part of the survey that encourages respondents to identify priority features for an ideal SAV system. And it uses a technique known as conjoint survey analysis. And in a little bit, we'll talk about what that technique does and how it can be easily embedded into some statistical modeling. Next slide. Before we show this video, it's helpful to figure out how we actually recruited participants. So a lot of our participation was gathered from social media advertisements. So we ran Facebook ads that popped up on people's Facebook news feeds, and offered an incentive for filling out a 15 to 20-minute survey about automated vehicles in the Minneapolis and St. Paul Twin Cities area. So that was our main source of recruitment. We also reached out to neighborhood associations and encouraged them to pass it out on their listservs. Generally speaking, this was a lot less fruitful. A lot of the neighborhood associations didn't respond back to us. We were trying to do this to capture people who might not necessarily be on social media. There were a few respondents who did come from this source of recruitment. We used a $50 Visa gift card as an incentive with a random drawing to select 40 winners. And we did the actual selection after the survey administration was completed. For the Facebook ads, we targeted participants first geographically and then demographically. And we kept iterating our targeting system to make sure that our sample was representative of the geographic spread of people living in the Twin Cities metro area, and also gender and racial slash ethnic demographics as well, trying to make sure that our sample mirrored the general diversity of the metro area itself. After a couple rounds of Facebook ads, this is all over the summer and fall of 2020, to give you all some context, our sample wasn't sufficiently representative, so we used a paid Qualtrics panel to fill in the gaps. And that got our sample to be pretty representative of the metro overall. And after that, we started our data analysis process. So I think the next slide is this video that we showed people when they started the survey. Could somebody just, yeah, I think clicking the video, and if sound is good to go, everyone should hear the music, but there's no audio, it's only music, so it should be fine either way.
Like the music.
Yeah, that was the opening video that everyone who took the survey saw. So people were taking this survey online, right? They were taking it on their phones, they were taking it on their computers. We tried to make sure that it was optimized for both mobile usage and for desktop or laptop computer usage. But you could not take the survey unless you watched that video. And so the goal there was to make sure that everyone had at least the same baseline understanding of what an SAV system would look like. The video features sort of constant footage of automobiles and vehicles that are large enough to include multiple people. And the one that is shown driving across the Mississippi River on the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus has, a few people in it actually sharing the vehicle together. So, that was the reason why that footage was the most frequent, right? We wanted to really ground this idea of this is the closest analog that you could think of is a driverless bus. We're going to use the term SAVs, which is more technical and accurate throughout this presentation. We do throughout our research, but we were trying to present something that was as least technical as possible for the participants, just giving them the understanding of this is what we're going to be talking about for the next 15 minutes of survey. And we can go to the next slide. So the first section of the survey asks these general questions. Most importantly for the research, it tries to gauge familiarity with and comfort with SAVs and also with general vehicle sharing. And after the pandemic began in March of 2020, we had to seriously amend how we were asking these questions. Initially, we were just going to ask a question about general comfort in a vehicle like the one you saw in the video, an SAV, and general comfort in transit, right? However, we wanted to then make sure that we weren't going to be conflating people's general comfort in transit in the middle of COVID-19 with their general comfort with sharing a public vehicle with other people. And so we split that into two questions, asking how comfortable are you taking transit right now in the pandemic, and how comfortable would you be taking transit before the pandemic? So some of those answers, there was generally a correlation, but there was usually more discomfort currently than there would have been before the pandemic began. And then we asked about the maximum dollar amount a participant would pay to ride an SAV from their home to downtown Minneapolis, and the maximum tolerated wait time for that same trip. And so these were scalable options where they could drag a bar on their screen to a specific dollar amount or a specific wait time. And then we started asking questions about demographics, and we'll see exactly the data we get from that in a little bit, and their general transportation behavior. Do they own a car? Do they have a driver's license, et cetera? Some of the demographic things we looked at, aside from the usual gender and race, we asked for self-reported health. Do they feel as if their health is, good, bad, fair, poor, excellent on a Likert scale? If they were foreign born, a few other things. We put a lot of thought into figuring out exactly the right type of information that might be a factor in people's comfort levels with SAV technology. Next slide. So the second survey section began with this request to locate their primary place of residence. And so this was the part of the survey that was really coding intensive. We had a GIS scientist from the university's GIS lab helping us with this. And so the next set of slides on the survey were all interactive maps where people could drop a pin and then also cross-check where that pin would spit out a specific address to make sure that they were, dropping a pin in the exact right location. They could also type in an address. You can see off to the upper left corner, there's a search icon. If they click on that, they can type in an address and the map would gravitate toward it, and then they confirm with the pin. So it was a sort of two-factor authentication, if you will. Like, we were making sure that people were clicking the right address and also having the right location. So there's less room for human error in either of those. And we started by asking where they live. And then we used the same interface for several other questions. Next slide. So with that same interface, they then start to self-report travel behavior. So we have a series of categories for where they would have gone. And this is less important for this specific research, but I'm going over it because it does spit out an important variable we use. But we would ask, identify all the places that you went last week for grocery shopping or for education, your own education or a family member's education. And we had about 15 different categories people would check off before they got to the maps, which ones of these, like, did you make trips for these purposes? Check all that apply. Once they did that, they then start dropping pins where they actually went. So for each location that they recall visiting, once they've narrowed down the possible reasons they could be traveling outside of their home, they would cross-check with the address and place it on the map. So identify the location, identify how they got there, what transportation modes they used. And this is where it gets really important for this paper. Identify if going to that location was a hassle or a difficulty. And we use the word hassle because we thought it was a really clear, fairly colloquial way to express the idea of going from your home to this place is not enjoyable, presents you difficulties. And if they identified something as a hassle to go from point A to point B, we asked them why. Was it logistically difficult? Was it expensive? Was it unsafe? And so we use this to generate a variable that's going to show up in some of the analysis later on, which we call the hassle ratio, which is just how many trips led to a hassle compared to their total trip count that they reported over the last week. The important thing to remember is this does lack some external validity, certainly to before the pandemic, and I think to some degree now as well, as people have started going back to more routine weekly travel behavior. This was in the fall and summer of 2020 when travel behavior was still somewhat restricted, but at least for that snapshot in time, it gives us a good picture of where people were going. And, you know, in a lot of cases, the places they were going were places that were pretty important for them to go to. You know, getting groceries was still pretty crucial for a lot of people if you weren't ordering groceries in during the time. And if getting groceries is a hassle, that's an important thing to know. If all of your trips that you took were hassles, but you still took the trips, that means the demand to take those trips is fairly inelastic. Next slide. So the next section was the conjoint analysis section. So this section also required a lot of coding in the survey instrument, but we presented participants with 5 choices between 2 bundles of randomly generated possible features of shared automated vehicles. So table 1 at the bottom of this slide shows the categories that would show up in these bundles. So we had payment system, booking system, storage space, security measures, sitting room, seating layout, and extra amenities. Each of these categories had a baseline amenity or a baseline feature that was considered the norm, and then something additional to that. And so each of the buckets that's shown in figure 2 in option A or option B is a randomly generated combination of one of each of those 7 categories. So for example, for a payment system, the option is either going to randomly include an app-only payment system or an app and onboard payment system where somebody could hypothetically board a vehicle and then pay either with cash or a card as they board it, as opposed to something that's more frequently associated with, say, ride hailing, where you pay effectively in advance, or you make a contract to pay in advance, right? And so once these 2 options or bundles are presented in front of them, participants are asked to look at each option and click the one that they would prefer. And notice that stuff like cost is not really an issue here. We're really trying to look at the possible features and ask people to identify what they would want to ride in if cost were a non-issue. And so we do this 5 times with 5, or 10 differently randomly generated bundles, and for each of those pairs, they pick one. The other thing that we did was we hard coded it so that bundles must have at least 2 features different, right? We didn't want people to coincidentally see the same thing twice, because that gives us no information, right? So we wanted to make sure that at least to some degree, there was enough differentiation between the 2 bundles that would allow us to make some causal inference from it. What's really nice about this method is that because we're randomly generating the presence of a specific feature of a specific category in each of these options, causal inference is really easy. We're effectively running an experiment within a survey here. And the experiment is testing the importance of each of these possible features compared to the baseline for making people select a given bundle. I'm going to stop here and see if anyone has questions, because I know that this is sort of could be a mouthful. If there's anyone who wants me to clarify anything here.
This is great stuff. I'm teaching survey methods right now, and I hope my students are all paying attention.
Yeah, it was really, I think this is my favorite part of the paper, if you couldn't tell. And it was really fun to sort of think through how we were going to embed this experiment basically in a survey and get a lot of good information from it. And one of my research focuses is causal inference. So, you know, the whole idea of running a really easy to use experiment and, you know, easy to administer experiment in this setting was pretty cool. And we'll talk about like how we bring this into statistics later on. The other thing that's great is this is really tractable into really simple statistical models.
We have a question.
Yes,
Yeah.
Noah, good afternoon. I have a question for you regarding the actual survey sections. What proportion of the respondents came from either first the like neighborhood associations, which proportion came from your Facebook ads, and then finally, which proportion came from the Qualtrics paid panel?
I think that might be in the summary statistics slide I'll be showing in a second. If it's not, I believe it's in the paper. I don't know it off the top of my head. I can tell you right now that the majority came from the advertisements. So over 50% were from the ads. I think it ended up becoming around like close to 70-30 with ads and Qualtrics, and truly like a tiny amount came from those neighborhood associations. It was not many at all. And in some of the modeling, we made sure to, well, we didn't incorporate the source in the modeling itself, but we did a lot of pre-modeling tests to make sure that there wasn't, you know, wildly different data that was coming from these different sources. People were generally reporting the same data, right? The only thing was that the Qualtrics panel was intended to make sure that our sample was more gender balanced, because the social media advertisements like overwhelmingly were attracting women, and then also a little bit more racially diverse, because the social media advertisements did disproportionately attract white participants. But yeah, I think the majority still came from social media, and truly like very few came from the neighborhood associations.
I think there might be a hand raised on mine too.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
And
someone,
there's a
someone wanted to know why not use an experimental design.
So this is functionally an experimental design, right? Like these are randomly generated features that are popping up in this survey, and we're experimenting the presence of this feature. How does that affect someone's willingness to select either of these two options, right? Does the presence of, say, storage space for bikes affect the overall collection of amenities? And so this is an experimental design. I mean, I'm not entirely sure how else to use like a fully experimental design in this context, other than doing a conjoint survey system here. Did that sort of answer the question? I'm not sure if I fully follow.
They haven't said anything else.
Yeah, good answer, Noah.
Cool.
Okay, another question in the room?
Hi, Noah, and thanks for, I'm wondering how you get to show the ads. Do you have to pay Facebook or something to be showing the ads, or can you tell us more about how you actually, like partner with them to present those things?
Yeah, so the ads were paid, and then the Facebook gives you like a number of ways to target. So like Facebook has like ways to like infer people's general place of residence, even if nobody's like reporting their address to Facebook. And so we targeted to a few zip codes at first, and that wasn't getting us, a super representative sample. So then we shifted our targeting to demographics, to people who worked certain types of jobs, to people who might have reported going to a high school in a certain area, all of that sort of stuff. But yeah, you pay for a number of, like, I'm trying to remember exactly because this, when we did pay for the ads, it was a while ago. But you basically pay for like a frequency or density of how frequent it would show up across different Facebook users' feeds. And then because Facebook owns Instagram, it does the same with Instagram. So, and we made sure that when people took the survey, they reported if they, heard the ad from Facebook or from Instagram. The experiment in this survey is about the presence of it. Let me, I guess, rephrase. Somebody's asking about to repeat the experiment in the survey. It's really 7 different experiments embedded into one survey. And each experiment is hypothetically, how does the appearance of a given feature affect people's overall selection of a specific bundle of features? And we can infer from that revealed preferences across all the different features. So there are really 7 experiments, right? And the treatment in each would be something that is different from the baseline. So in category / experiment 1, we're looking at payment system. The question is, do people value the presence of an app and onboard payment system compared to just app only? And if we see overwhelmingly that people are clicking options that have that specific randomly generated feature in it, then we're getting to answer that question. So the hypothesis is, you could say that it's the difference from the baseline is what induces the selection, right? The next question is, why the appearance of the feature and not the functionality? What is the value of the results? We'll get to what these look like when you start estimating stuff statistically, because we get to see how people actually value different features. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by why the appearance of the feature and not the functionality, though. Are you asking like why we are just showing something really short and straightforward as opposed to describing how something would work?
I think we should just keep going.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure people understood how we ran this in the survey, because the statistical part and the information we gather from it is going to come up in a pretty short while here. And then you'll start to see, hopefully you'll start to connect this figure 2, what people actually saw on the screen of their survey, with the information that we gather and the inferences that we can make that are really rich. So we can go to the next slide.
They said, you said the choice of if people on the appearance versus the person choosing the use.
Maybe we can come back to that.
Yeah, let's just keep going.
Oh, the by appearance, I mean, does that feature show up in a bundle? To get to that. So, okay. So here's just first a map of where our participants live in the 7-county Twin Cities metro area. Minneapolis and St. Paul are shaded in red and blue respectively. Those are the city borders. So as you can see, most of our respondents came from the central city area. In our metro, we consider both Twin Cities as the central city. Neither is a suburb of the other, right? And the surrounding areas, especially the inner first and second ring suburbs, had a fair amount of respondents as well. Especially the suburbs immediately surrounding Minneapolis and the cluster of suburbs that are just to the north of St. Paul, which are pretty densely populated suburbs. As you go farther out into the country, there's fewer respondents. And this is effectively what we were trying to aim for. We really wanted to look at people who were living in and around the Twin Cities themselves. We actually had an auxiliary project that we ran at the Minnesota State Fair in person in the fall of 2021, where we got a bunch of respondents from rural areas, because the State Fair attracts people from all around, we call it outstate Minnesota, the greater non-Twin Cities parts of the state. It also attracts people from the Dakotas and Iowa and Wisconsin. It's like a huge ordeal. And even at that relatively sparsely populated fair, compared to at least this past year's in 2022, we had a really good proportion of respondents of this survey who were from rural areas in Minnesota and Wisconsin, not inside the Twin Cities metro. So that's why we're really focusing, trying to get an urban sample here, because we already had another plan to look at people living in rural areas, because their entire transportation preferences and behavior is going to look really different from people who are living, in the Twin Cities, in Minneapolis or St. Paul, and can make a choice every day between taking the bus or maybe driving or taking the light rail. Going off to the table on the side, there's just some baseline demographics that we're gathering. Right off the bat, you can see our dependent variables, the maximum wait time in minutes, the comfort with SAV, the maximum payment. Our sample size was about 400. It was 413 in final after we cleaned and got rid of people who only filled out like a tiny portion of the survey. We did some sensitivity testing and made sure that those people that we cleaned out were not, different in what they did report than others. So we're trying to make sure we weren't censoring any information. There was a couple of issues with some people not like fully answering the wait time and payment question. So our data is a little bit lower for those two variables. But for the most part, we had pretty good compliance here. The maximum wait time is about 15 minutes. Then maximum payment about $12.5, and people reported a comfort with the SAV on a Likert scale of about 4, so fairly comfortable, but not very comfortable. People overall felt less comfortable with shared vehicles during the pandemic, but you can see before COVID that was higher. Our age on average was about 35, and most of our participants earned between $25,000 and $75,000 of income. People were generally reporting very good or good health. Most people always had automobile access. A little bit over half of the sample was white, which generally does mirror the Twin Cities metro area. With the Qualtrics panel, we got pretty close to gender balance, which we didn't have beforehand. We also asked about cohabitation. That was a demographic feature that we didn't mention earlier. Forgot to bring that up. Most people lived with their spouse or partner. Not most, just under most actually, but a strong plurality did. Most respondents weren't foreign born. During that study period, people were taking about 9.5 trips per week. A little bit over half of the respondents lived in a central city, like in Minneapolis or St. Paul. We calculated the activity space. We did like the convex hull of all their trips, and that gave us a square mile activity space of about 101 square miles, and about 40%, right? About 38% of the trips that people were taking, they were claiming led to some hassle. So that is the sort of broad strokes of what our sample looked like that we're now going to dig into and try to answer these research questions with. Next slide. So the next couple of slides here all do looking at the willingness to adopt. And we examine determinants of willingness to adopt by running 3 different models. We do 2 ordinary least squares models, just running linear regression of the maximum payment and the maximum wait time on the demographics that we were gathering. And then we do a multinomial logit to see how comfortable people were with SAVs on the Likert scale. So our first finding that we're going to highlight is there's not much difference by gender. And as I go through each of these sort of categories, there's a different slide with each section highlighted. So we can just go to the next slide. For race, Black and Hispanic participants were more willing to pay and wait for the SAV service than white participants, which were the baseline here. As you can see, there's about $6.50 difference between Black participants and white participants in their maximum payment on average, and about a $5.35 difference between Hispanic or Latino participants compared to white participants on average in their payments. And at least at a 10% significance level, you see about a 2-minute increase in the maximum wait time for both groups. We can go to the next slide. Right off the bat, as expected, this is sort of a good sign that we were getting data that was making sense. Income was positively correlated with willingness to pay. When we asked for income, we asked for people to do it in a discretized way. So like they weren't just specifying their exact income, they were reporting if it was between some of these brackets. And compared to people who were earning under 50K, people who were earning between 50K and 100K were about $1.50 more likely to, or more willing to pay. And those who are earning above 100K were about almost $4 more likely to pay. This is holding everything else constant, of course. So this is all these are results from specific single regressions. There wasn't much difference by automobile access or by age cohort. So we can go to the next slide down here with cohabitation. Those with children were more willing to wait for SAVs than those with adults, but that was really the only difference here. And then now, finally, there's a fair amount of the miscellaneous variables that were statistically significant. People who are comfortable with shared transit during the pandemic correlated strongly with their maximum pay and wait times, and pre-COVID comfort with transit correlated with likely shared automated vehicle comfort too. And foreign-born individuals are more willing to pay and wait, and those with more hassles in their daily travel were more willing to pay, which starts lending to the conclusion that people could see SAVs as a way to bypass their, current travel obstacles that they face. People who deal with more difficulty in their day-to-day travels are more willing to pay for a service that would help bypass those same hassles. Next slide. So now we're going to get into the conjoint analysis. And it's going to be a similar setup for flipping through the slides here. So we have a few different tables in the paper that show how we report this. So statistically, what we do is we run first we transform the data so that each bucket, each bundle is one observation. So that's why you're seeing observations here in the full sample of 400 or 4,120. There were 412 participants who did the conjoint part of the survey, and each of those participants saw 10 bundles each. They selected 5 of those bundles each. So we run regressions of the selection of a bundle, which is captured in a simple 0-1 binary, on the presence of each of these features compared to their baseline feature that was shown in the table a few slides ago. And so this is why the conjoint analysis is really powerful. It actually allows us to infer how much people are valuing these specific features. So when we're looking at the full sample, most of the non-baseline features positively affect selection. People are about 1.2 times more likely to select a bundle if that bundle includes a full app and onboard payment system compared to just an app-only system. The same holds for if they can hail or book the system from an app or a text or a call. Then for storage space, the baseline was no storage space. The vehicles featured no additional storage space for anything else you'd want. And everything but strollers positively induced selection of that bundle. Then for security, both having a camera or an attendant induced selection of the bundle, by about twice as much compared to if that bundle did not have or featured the baseline, right? If it had no storage space at all. People valued ample sitting room. They did not value facing each other. This is the only example of a baseline that was preferred to the additional layer. People wanted seats that faced straight forward all in the same direction, which was the baseline we used. And then for extras, you know, our baseline here was there was no additional thing, but if a bundle featured power outlets or free Wi-Fi, people were more likely to pick it. For the like statistical inference, if folks are curious, we clustered errors at the participant level because each participant's popping up in this data set 10 specific times because we're looking at the 10 random bundles they saw. So yeah, we can go to the next slide, or actually no, before we go to the next slide, I'll report the gender differences because they're on this first table. So then if you look at the next sets of columns here and you start looking at the odds ratios for women versus men, we omitted people who identified as non-binary or gender non-conforming here because the sample size was really small and we would not have been able to run any regressions on it. We had like under 10 participants who fit those identities. So we just compared women and men here. For men, most of the features that are significant across the board for everyone are not necessarily significant, right? And the coefficients tend to be a little bit lower. However, for women, all of the features that are non-baseline are significant. And so what this tells us is that men display more indifference overall than women when it comes to design considerations of SAVs. One important area where both men and women did value non-baseline features was security, but the magnitude of the effect of having a camera or an attendant show up in that bundle is a lot higher for women than it is for men. For storage space, men exhibited less value toward bags, and they exhibited insignificant preferences. They were effectively statistically indifferent when it came to payment and booking. Even for some of the extra amenities, they exhibited less strong preferences than women. For example, for power outlets, the presence of power outlets made women twice as likely to pick a bundle than a bundle that had no power outlets in it. And for men, that same odds ratio is only 1.2. So we can go to the next slide here. So now we turn to splitting out white participants from all participants of color, and then specifically Black and Hispanic participants. Overall, a lot of the same significance is seen primarily among white participants. For all participants of color, the significance goes down for a lot of the different variables. And then if you look specifically at Black and Hispanic participants, the significance continues to go away. So for example, you can look at sitting room. That's a significant, in the presence of ample sitting room in a bundle makes people 1.3 times more likely in general, makes white people 1.4 times more likely to pick that bundle. But for Black and Hispanic participants, it's a lower coefficient, right? So the pattern here is that there's generally less significance across the board, which means there's generally less preferences or fewer design or feature preferences for participants of color, and specifically Black and Hispanic participants. So we can go to the next slide. So for healthy and unhealthy participants, we just broke down their self-reported health. If they considered themselves in good health or above, we considered them healthy. And if they said their health was fair or poor, we considered them unhealthy. Flexible booking, bicycle space, and security cameras and ample sitting room, compared with the respective baseline, increased the likelihood of selection more for unhealthy participants than for healthy participants here. But both groups, generally speaking, exhibited some preferences. The flexible booking space, especially, is something that unhealthy participants, people who self-reported as not being particularly healthy or having fair or poor health, reported as something that would increase their likelihood of selection. And so we could go to the last slide here, and we turn to analysis by income. When it comes to income, there's really not much difference across the board. We don't see those same patterns of the preferences being more indifferent with subsets of the population. Splitting up the population by income doesn't really change the coefficients all that much, and it doesn't really change the significance of the appearance of a specific bundle all that much either. All right, and I think we're going to start wrapping up here. So the next slide. So I wanted to just sort of take two main takeaways here, and this was going back to these motivations. As SAV systems are something that policymakers and planners continue to look at as a future solution for transportation issues that have plagued urban areas for a while, especially the first and last mile problems, they really need to think about design-based considerations. This is one of the main reasons why we did this research to begin with. There had been some research about willingness to pay for automated vehicles and safety considerations, but not much research about what actual users would want to see in the vehicles themselves, and how those considerations differed by demographics, by barriers to transportation, etc. And so if we want to advance equity goals, and we want to make sure that these systems are actually being used by people across cities, by people of different socioeconomic status, by people of different genders and racial and ethnic backgrounds, we need to take design considerations very seriously. Designing an SAV system that didn't necessarily feature some sort of security measure would be barring certain populations from wanting to use that system. And if that's the case, then what's the point of rolling out a system like that to begin with if our goal is to solve transportation equity issues and transportation accessibility issues? So I think that is really the main punchline of this paper, and this research in general, is we can't take new transportation technologies in a vacuum when it comes to equity. And the best way to start understanding that is to directly ask people themselves what they value, what problems they currently have, and how they can see this technology solving it. So I think the last slide here is just some acknowledgements, some of our help from various research assistants, and then people who made the video, helped code the survey instrument and gave us some feedback. And then this, like I had said earlier at the beginning, this was a project that was a big NSF award that was provided to a bunch of different researchers affiliated with the University of Minnesota Center for Transportation Studies. And that's what funded the project, how we paid for the incentives, how we paid the consultants we used to help make the survey, how we paid for the Facebook advertisements. When we were at the state fair, we had to pay for a booth there, and also tablets to run the survey on. So yeah, with that, I'll open it up to more questions, and hope everyone thought this was interesting and insightful. And I think the paper has been made available to anyone if you want to read further, and feel free to email me if you have any questions too.
All right, let's give Noah a hand. Thank you, everyone. We have about 14 minutes for questions. 16 minutes for questions. Let me open it up to the room first, and then we'll check online to see if we've got questions. Yes.
Thank you, Noah, for this study. I was wondering, because it was mostly done by online surveying, did you do any complementary or anything additional to capture maybe the elderly or people with disabilities that maybe are not using internet as much, but are very, attractive population for SAV?
So that was something that we ended up doing more of when we were at the state fair, for that exact reason. And a lot of the respondents that we talked to at the state fair were elderly. We actually went to the state fair on the Minnesota State Fair has like days that it runs for certain communities. And so we went on Senior Citizen Day. And so we ended up gathering a lot of information on that population there. And the survey was tweaked a little bit to talk a little bit more about ability and accessibility there. But yeah, I think that just points to a limitation of this specific side of the research, was that because we were running this on social media during the pandemic, we were going to get, a fairly truncated age range. We did have a couple of elderly participants who did the survey. I think our maximum age from the social media recruitment was about 80. But we didn't find anything that seriously differed in the outcomes of the survey itself by age, which is why it wasn't something that we looked at in the conjoint analysis. For the state fair version of this stuff, we took it way more seriously because we had a much higher sample size of people who were disabled and people who were elderly.
Noah, great presentation, thank you. So I have a question regarding actually, regarding the, how do I say, maybe even policing of the SAVs. And I don't want to say policing, but what I'm trying to get at is like the regulation and like identifying who the users are. Whether people are going to be required to provide like their driver's licenses or government ID in order to use the SAV. And the reason I ask this is a lot of like the first and last mile, there were a lot of first and last mile bike share companies in mainland China. And when they tried to export this business model to other countries and cities throughout the world, it proved that the business model was not feasible, owing to the fact that there were like dedicated groups of people who would go out and destroy these bikes and such. And so my question is, if the demographic that is most willing to use these SAVs is also the same demographic that may have difficulty accessing government issued IDs and such, to what extent did that go into your own consideration and to any future consideration of the real world implementation of the SAV program?
I think the extent to which it went into our consideration was trying to think through possible ways that people could logistically like pay and book one of these. But in terms of the specific thing you're asking about, we didn't really delve into it too much, to be honest. A lot of our baseline writing on this and the full report that the Center for Transportation Studies released that compiles all of the different analyses that went into the project sets up sort of a scenario where we're assuming that these SAV systems have to be run, at least with some public funding, and are going to be operated through something that looks like a transit system. I think we relied on that narrative a lot in the research just to sort of make things more tractable for the user. That's a really important question, though, I think for further investigation and for future avenues here. But we couldn't tackle it all.
Other questions? Is there anything online?
Yeah, so
Yeah, there's a couple in the chat.
can you see them then?
I can, yeah.
Would you mind reading them out and then responding? Thanks.
Yeah, so Tara is asking, has any OEM or governmental agency shown interest in the research? We were talking with like transit agencies in the Twin Cities when we were working on it. I'd have to link back in with Yingling to see if there's been anything that she's heard since then. CTS partners really closely with the regional transit authority here. So the governance structure of the Twin Cities is interesting. Transit is done entirely on a regional level for those 7 counties that I showed in that map. So it's all one transit system for 7 counties, which is not totally uncommon in US cities. But they provided a lot of input into this, and there were also people at the Minnesota Department of Transportation that were helping out with the broader team of researchers as well. So to that extent, the answer is yes. Since this paper has been published, I'm not sure if there's anyone who has, sought it out and tried to get in touch with us. There's a really good question about defining in the questionnaire what we meant by limited versus ample seating. We actually didn't, with the hope that people, the part of the goal of this is just to see, generally speaking, how much do people value this specific amenity, right? And so if you see two bundles and one is limited seating and one is ample seating, most people are probably going to monotonically prefer ample seating, right? Like there might be some people who are a little bit indifferent. There might be some really bizarre person who's like, yeah, I don't want there to be much seating. I think standing room is better for whatever reason. But it's about weighing those versus other features, right? And so if the presence of ample seating dominated the presence of all of the other features to the point where it really increased the probability of selection of a bundle that, had all the baselines but ample seating, and then another bundle that had all the really nice stuff, security cameras, power outlets, etc., but it had limited seating, then we would know that ample seating is really powerful and people really wanted these vehicles to be spacious and comfortable inside, right? So that was our reason. The other thing is we just wanted this to be really straightforward, right? We didn't want to have too many words on the survey itself. The conjoint part was after people mapped potentially, on average 9 different locations specifically on a map, and then identified how they got to each of those locations. We wanted to make sure we would gather the last part of the data really quickly and really easily, and that'd be kind of fun and easy for the user to do, and still give us a lot of really rich information, which I think it did. But yeah, that we didn't explicitly define it for those reasons. And the last question is, did we find a cost per mile on SAVs on average in the inelastic travel or elastic? As in, you're asking if like as people went farther, if their home was farther from the downtown, if that increased their willingness to pay by a certain amount? Is that what that question's getting at?
They haven't said anything else, but they had another question under it, and it said that the cost found is higher than the current available transit. So I don't know if that ties into that.
I mean, I don't, this paper has nothing to do with like the actual costs, right? It's looking at willingness to pay, which is different than the actual pricing of something. People were, for the cost of downtown Minneapolis, I think for the most of the time, people were more willing to pay for this than they would than the current pricing of transit, right? So I think that's something to start getting at the answer here. I think interestingly enough, we didn't see a massive correlation between willingness to pay and how far they live from downtown. That was something that was kind of surprising, which we were kind of expecting, and hopefully that answers that first question. But that really wasn't, if we wanted to go back and use this data again and do like a really formal like demand estimation, like we could. That wasn't the goal of this specific paper.
I mean, let me ask a question. Did you do any follow-up interviews or have any open-ended responses to explore some of the reasons for the patterns that you were seeing, particularly any that surprised you from what you expected?
No, not in this part of the research. It was people who took the survey and put in their information, and then we got back to them if they won a prize. But no, we didn't go back and like try to interview people or anything.
Any other
We
questions?
could in the future.
Yeah, be a good idea. Any other questions? All right, well, with that, let's give another round of thanks to Noah. Spending your afternoon with us. And take care.
All right, thanks everyone.